Hi everyone, this is Shireen, one of the tutors for the FEND program. And in this video, we're going to do just a quick walkthrough of the first project. And for this project, you're going to use the HTML and CSS skills that you learned in the lessons to build out your own personal blog. And before we get started here, I want to go through a couple examples that they provided here. So let's take a look at the first example. So they mentioned here this one does not use a design system. We'll go over it just in a little bit what a design system is. But for this one, for now, let's look at this layout here. This is a fairly simple layout. You have your typical 2-column grid, and you have a header component up here with the blog title, a subscription link, and a search field. And then you have your grid over here, 2 columns and 3 rows. And then down here, we have just a simple footer. And then when you click on one of these items here, it should bring you to this blog post page. This one is still a 2-column layout, except this one is a narrow one where you can include links if you want to, about section, and then you have your main content over here. And then let's look at the second example here. So this second example uses, it's still a grid layout. You have 2 columns. If you want to think about it that way, but instead of, a grid for the blog items, it's just a horizontal list. And then right here, a sidebar, you can include, links, extra links that you can set up. You can link out to Twitter or GitHub, Instagram, whatever you like. And then you have your full length subscribe button, and then a footer down here. And then when you click on one of these, it brings you, this one's just a single layout column for the blog post page. And then it mentions here that the second example, again, uses a design system. Now, it's really common practice nowadays in industry to have some sort of design system for your project. And it's really helpful because it provides a standard for your components. And it leaves really no questions for developers, designers, project managers, whoever's working on a project. Everybody will be on the same page if you have a design system that tells you which fonts to use, which colors to use, which icons to use. You can include anything in a design system. And that's an example of it down here. And I want to show you another example of a design system that's used in industry, and that is material design. So material design is created by Google. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. And it's one of the components. Yeah, they have a whole list of components under material design. And let's look at the app bar component. This might be familiar to some of you if you're using like an Android phone, Google phone, or any Google app. And in this design system, Google tells you, under design, how to use it, the anatomy of it, behavior, and then theming if you want to change colors or change the shapes of the certain things for the app bar. And then they includes all these links that you can use. And then they even tell you how to implement it and how to make it more accessible, some properties that goes into it. That's just a whole lot going on here. But I just want to show you this, just an example of a design system being used in industry. So hopefully, with the examples that provided you, and that it helps you visualize the end product of your project and helps you get started. Now, let's look at the development strategy here. I'm not going to go through each of every point, but definitely go ahead and read through this. I think it has really good points on how you can tackle the project. But I first want to highlight these 2 right here. So as you're working on any project, whether code or just a general project management type project, you always want to plan, right? Planning is super important to have a good idea of what your overall structure of your project would look like. Draw out some sketches for your blog. You can use paper and pencil. if you want some practice with design tools, you can use tools like Sketch or Figma or Marvel app. Feel free to use those and play around with it. So when you having an idea of what the structure of your project will be really helpful, because you know exactly what the layout will be like and the components that you need to create. So you don't get overwhelmed by code so quickly. And let me show you an example. This was a project I worked on, a personal project I worked on a long time ago. It's called Top Setup. It's the website where I wanted people to submit, pictures of their desk setup, their gaming setups, and then they can include a list of the items that they have on their setup. So for this wireframe, I just created a simple sketch. I wanted images here, and then some buttons where they can like, upvote, downvote, add to favorites, whatever, share. And then down here, the comment section, and then on the sidebar here, a list of their items with and also links to similar builds. So here's an example of just a sketch that you can do. It's really quick, doesn't take that much effort to do. Just draw it on pencil, helps you visualize what your project will look like. And then if you want to go play around with a design tool, you can use something like Figma or Sketch. I like Figma. I love using Figma because it's free and it's online. I can access it from different devices. Sketch is really popular, but you can only use it on Macs. So that's not great, right? If you want to access it from other devices. So here's an example of the mock-up of the previous sketch that you saw. It looks really similar, but it has some small differences. Here I have, the header for the site, the username, and then the same thing with the images down here, some description and comments and a list. So this is just another way that you can use on how to, plan out your project. It's really helpful because then, when I start coding this project, I know exactly where the components will go, exactly what colors to use, and so I don't waste time worrying about that as I code. Now, the caveat here is don't spend too much time planning. The idea is you want to be agile, and they mention it down here, right here, point 8, and also point number 10. Be taking an iterative approach. Don't spend hours and hours just designing your project. The idea is you want to be agile. Have an initial design that you're happy with, and then start coding. And then as you code, look back on the rubrics, look back at your designs, test out the website and see how it works. And then if you don't like something, then go back and design it again. So, and then you just rinse and repeat. That way, you don't spend too much time stuck on just one thing. And this is a really popular software engineering approach called Agile. I will include a link to the guide to Agile. It's definitely worth just skimming over it because a lot of companies use it nowadays for project management. So have a look when you get a chance. And let's go over the rubric. Again, I don't want to go through each and every one of these, but I do want to highlight some of the major ones that a lot of students tend to miss, or stuff that reviewers tend to look at. So the first thing here is CSS imports. You want to use at least 3 imported files. And just a tip or a hint, I guess. This is I think the easiest way to achieve this rubric item is to have a design system. You could have a CSS file for fonts or colors or icons, and then once you have that, you can include that in your main CSS file. Or you could also add more pages, like an about page or a contact page, and then have a CSS file for each of the pages, and then import it in your main CSS file. So these are just a couple ways that you can use to meet the specification for this rubric. It doesn't have to be fancy. If you're creating a design system, it doesn't have to be fancy. You can keep it simple with just a few fonts and a few colors. It doesn't have to be anything like material design. That's just too much. And then next, the links here. So the links, all the links on your page have to be working. It has to be functional. Let's go back to an example over here. So what we're talking about here is the continue reading links. Or if you click on one of these cards, it has to bring you, the link that brings you to this page has to be functional, right? Or if you have links that bring you to, for example, Twitter or GitHub or Facebook, that has to be working. But you don't have to include any personal links if you don't want to. It could just be a generic to the Facebook homepage or YouTube homepage, something like that. And then also if you implemented something like the subscribe link or the follow subscribe button here, those can be dummy links. You haven't learned how to create these functions yet with JavaScript. So these can be dummy links. The most important thing is the links that brings you to the blog post page. Those has to be functional. And then the rest of these, pretty straightforward. Just make sure you're hitting all the items that are listed here. And then for the blog pattern, all these have to be included. You're free to add more to it. But just as long as you meet the minimum requirements listed in the rubric, you're free to add whatever you want to your website. And then next thing, make sure you use Flexbox and CSS Grid at least twice. If you are using the example blog website here, I think these are pretty simple layouts for blogs. It might look like much, but really there's a lot of reusable components here. So if you are following these, you should be able to hit this rubric item pretty easily. Let's look, this one is a grid. So that's one. And then within each of these cards, you probably want to use Flexbox since it's just a one-dimensional layout. Same with the header component here. So that's 2 Flexbox usages. And then for the blog post here, if you use a grid for the main content over here, that's another use of grid. So just keep that in mind. You have to use it at least twice for each of them. And then the next really important thing to keep in mind of is the responsiveness of your site. Nowadays sites have different screens, screen sizes. You have, laptops and phones and iPads, tablets, what have you. So it's really important that your site is responsive. And if you're using Flexbox or CSS Grid, your site should be fairly responsive from the get-go. Both have some kind of built-in responsiveness checks into them, but you might have to add your own media queries for certain breakpoints for components. Like if you're using, a box, for example, with set height and width using pixels, you might want to change that to percentages. Same thing with fonts. If you're using pixel, it's really hard for it to be responsive. So maybe change that to percentages or using relative units. And then the next thing here is the Chrome DevTools. This will be your best friend if you're a front-end developer. I use the DevTool basically for anything front-end. There's just so much to it too. That's the element page, the console tab, the sources, network, all these you don't really have to worry about right now. But I think the most important ones for you guys at this stage is the elements tab. If you hover over this, it tells you where all the components are, and then even the CSS styles that is using. If you click, for example, on quality here, it tells you all the CSS that has been set for it. And then if you scroll all the way down, it tells you the box model. So the content has this dimension with this much padding on the left side and then this much margin on the bottom. So that's really helpful for you to, go in and debug your site. If something's not working quite right, you can see exactly what has been compiled. And then you can use it the other way too. So you can right click, for example, if I want to see responsiveness, right click, hit inspect, it brings me directly to the element here. So if I need to look at that. And then the next thing is this little icon up here. If you click on it, it brings up the responsive view. And here you can really play around with how the site will look like responsively. And if you notice here, the Udacity rubric site isn't quite responsive. So that's something that has to be fixed. But yeah, you play around with it. It can go that way or this way. You can also access different devices. Up here, like the Galaxy, this is what the site will look like. iPhone 6, there are a lot too, and then you can hit edit to add a lot more. So play around with it, get really familiar with it. Again, I said this tool is used basically every day for front-end developers. And then another thing I do want to mention is if you notice the box model down here, every element on a web page is a box. So I just want to point that out to get your mind to think in boxes. I think it's a lot easier to understand Flexbox or CSS Grid if you think of your website in boxes, right? For example, for this Udacity site, the header here is a box, and then if you scroll down, this rubric table is a box, and then within the rubric table, we have, smaller boxes. So I think if you think of it in boxes, you can, plan out this layout of your project. You know exactly what's a grid, where to use Flexbox. I think that would help. Now, I think that's most of it. And then the rest of the rubric here, again, is pretty straightforward. Down here talks about the quality of your code. Just make sure your code is readable. You're using semantic tags. Make sure your CSS class names and those are using hyphens. There are just little things here. Just make sure your code is readable, and that's really important so that other people can read your code. And then down here, it tells you just some suggestions on how you can make your project better. Definitely worth, if you have extra time to implement your project, definitely take the time to make it stand out and make it fun. Have fun with the project. I think that's a awesome way to learn, is to make your project your own, so you care more about it. Okay, so let's go back here. Yeah, project cheat sheet. They didn't have this before when I was taking the course, but I think it has some helpful things on here. Especially the CSS grid and the Flexbox attributes here. These are really, really common attributes that you'll be using if you're using grid or Flexbox. So it's really helpful to just have this open as you're coding your project. Same thing with some media queries down here and some links to some resources. And then with that, let's go over, since we have a little bit of time, let's go over and code up. I will go through and code just this homepage of the blog example. I won't do this part, just going through the homepage here so that you can see how I would code this project, the decisions that I would make as I code this. Disclaimer, I have not actually implemented this project. When I took the course, it was a slightly different project. It was a portfolio versus a blog. But I didn't want to do it beforehand just so that you can see like how I go about, debugging things, or how I, Google things. I think that would be helpful to see. And then another disclaimer, don't just copy and paste the code that we go through together here. That would be considered plagiarism and goes against the Udacity code. I don't want to get anybody in trouble, so just keep that in mind. But if you want to tackle the project on your own, feel free to stop the video now. And you can always come back later to reference the video once you're done. But Other than that, I think we can get started with the coding here. I'm gonna use Code Sandbox. Code Sandbox is just an online editor. Just so I can send the link, share everybody the project that we worked on in this webinar. So okay, so for Code Sandbox here, we just have a plain empty template. They've already included a viewport meta tag over here, so that makes our site responsive to different screen devices, screen device. And then the title here, I just changed this to personal blog website. And then I have an empty main.css file. All right, so let's create, let's look back at the example here. So we have a header component and this grid for the blog list, and then a footer. So let's create those sections right now. So I will use the semantic. Remember to use semantic HTML tags. So I have section, and I'm just going to copy and paste these for the other two sections. So now we have 3 sections. And then actually, since this is a header, instead of using section, I'm going to use header. And then within the header, we have 3 items, right? So we have the subscribe link, the blog title, and a search field. So I'm going to do a link for the subscribe. We're just going to do a dummy tag for now. And that's called subscribe. And then we have the blog title. Let's use H1 since it's the main website title. Blog title. H1, and then we have a search field icon. I do not have an icon right now, so let's just make this a simple paragraph text called search. Then if I save this, and you can see we have our components here. Now notice that is by default is in this vertical view. So since this is a one-dimensional, it's not really a grid, right? So it's just one-dimensional layout for this component. So I'm going to use Flexbox for this. So we don't want to use, it's not good practice to use inline style. So we're going to create a class called blog header. And you don't really want to use header in either in your main.css file because this is really generic. If you did header some style, it's going to affect all the other headers in your website. So it's good practice to use either a class or an ID. So we're going to use class. Blog header. The reason I chose to use class is because I might reuse this class for other components, because remember, IDs are unique to just one component, whereas a class you can use it for a lot of different other elements. Specifically for blog header, the chances I'm going to reuse this is slim, but I like to use just class anyway, just in case I need to use it later. So the blog header, we're going to use Flexbox. Basically flex, and then instead of in a column, we want it to be in a row. So we're going to change the direction here to a row. So let's go ahead and save that and see what happens. All right, so we have a row, but because the blog title here, if we inspect it, it has margins on it, and they are much bigger margins than the paragraph tag or the subscribe anchor link, which doesn't even have margins. So let's align these components. So we're going to do align items. And let's look at our example here. They are just centered, right? So we're going to align items center. Save what happens there. All right, so everything's aligned centered. And then I want it to be spaced apart. And the more you use Flexbox, you'll see a lot of the common attributes that you'll use. And then to do that, I'm going to use justify content. And then there are a lot of the options that you can use here, you can see. But to space it apart, I can use either space around, which would make it look like that. I have spaces around each of the elements. So if I inspect this, it doesn't actually add any margins or padding. It just moves the element on the page. It's built it into Flexbox. Or if I use space between, what does that look like? All right, so it just adds the spaces in between the elements versus around the elements. So I think let's use space between. It looks pretty similar here. And then subscribe button, if you notice here, is gray in color. So let's change that. So we have, I'm gonna close this sidebar here for now. href, let's add a class name. Subscribe link. All right, and then our main.css, we can have .subscribe link. We're gonna change the color to a gray color. Let's use gray. Or if we want to use hex values, I like to use color hex, I think it was called. Yeah, color hex, and then you can choose different colors over here on this site. So let's probably use this one, 8080. That looks pretty good. Yeah. So here, don't forget the £sign. Let's save and see what that looks like. It doesn't show anything because we need to turn off text decoration. Is the first thing. I want to remove the underline, so that removes the subscribe link. Subscribe link. All right, we have to debug why it's not oh, I spelled subscribe wrong. There we go. All right, as you can see here, text decoration removes the underline, and then color, you know, resets the color. I think that's a little too light, so let's pick 4C. I think that's a little darker. All right, that looks good. And actually the example has the underline on it, so let's remove that to just keep it the same. And then for the search, let's just leave the search for now. And then blog title, underline, and then the font looks good there, so we can leave that. And then let's do blog title. For class names and ID names, it's best if you can be as descriptive as possible. That way, you know, people won't be confused, you know, what class that applies to. They know exactly where to go look for something. So it's really helpful. So let's add an underline here. Text decoration, underline. All right, so we have a similar look here with our example. So now we have the main section, right? We have a grid. So let's do that. Main section with a grid. Save. All right. So I'm gonna call this blog main. And then in my CSS class, I can create class blog main, and then we're gonna use grid. Okay, so let's look back at the cheat sheet because I can't remember what to use. So display, grid, and then template rows, template columns, grid area. Okay, so go back to example here. We have 2 columns and 3 rows. Now the nice thing with grid here is they're not required. So I want it to have infinite rows. So I just have to do define the columns that I want. So display grid, And then we have grid template columns. Let's do 2 columns, right? And we're just gonna use 1 fraction for now to keep those two be able to resize as how they want to. So if I'm just gonna click and inspect here, go into the document. Now if I hover over blog main, it doesn't have anything right yet, right? So but if I click on grid, it brings up this grid view and I can visualize where my grid is. So we have 2 columns, and then with that height, and then if I added a grid template rows, and let's see if we just include 1 fraction, what happens. Go back into our section here, blog main. All right, looks like nothing happened. Okay, we're gonna pull up our handy dandy CSS grid guide. Okay, so to add the row, grid template rows, this one has 3 rows with these sizes. So let's do 100 pixels for now, just to test it out. This can always be changed later. So 100 pixel row. And then we're gonna go back into the section. And if you can see here, if you hit grid, if you hover over this, we have our first grid, which is 1 row and 2 columns, right? So if we want to have infinite rows, I will have to Google that. CS grid infinite rows. Again, we don't have to specify the amount of rows. We can just use grid auto rows. So let's change that in our code. We do grid auto rows, and we want it to be 100 pixel. All right, so we go back into the document over here. Right now it doesn't do anything since our grid items don't have anything in it. So let's put in some div tags just to test. Yeah, I'm gonna copy, paste. Now let's look. All right, if you look here, hover blog main, you can see our 6 div elements in there within the rows. Yeah, now we have our grid item, right? So let's go back here. For each of these cards will have a different thing. So now you haven't learned JavaScript yet. So if you know JavaScript, you can code this dynamically, but for now we're just gonna hard code it for each of these. I'm just gonna make it all the same to have the whirl card over here. So we have within each of the card, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items in it. So let's use div, and then we have the paragraph tag that says whirl, and then we have a header. We use h1 for the main post, so let's use h2 for the rest of these. There's a second level heading for each. So h2, I'm gonna do blog posts, right? Example blog post, and then date, description, and link. Posts, and then the date, today, November 12th. and then some description. We're gonna use the lorem text. Lorem is a really popular, just generic text you can use for testing. So we're just gonna copy just the first sentence here. All right, scroll over, and then the continue link. So link href. Let's do a dummy link for now. When you do implement this, instead of a dummy link, you will link it to the page for the blog post. So let's do that real quick. I'm just gonna create just an empty page for blog posts number 1.html. Okay, so since I have it in the same root directory, what I can do is just do blog dot single dot for current directory / blog post 1 HTML, and that will link me to that page. Now, if you're looking at a code sandbox here, notice that it has the package.json and sandbox config.json. You can just ignore that. That's just being used by the editor. That's not something that you have to include in your project. Just these 4 things is probably what I would use for the project. Okay. So now you can see we have our div item here. If we right click, inspect the first div, the div is only 100 pixels wide, but our items are exceeding that. So we want that to be a little bit more responsive, right? So we're gonna do in our main.css for our class name, blog item, we'll name it blog item, copy, save. For now, I'm gonna put just auto, right? See what happens there. Okay, our div is right now the size of our content. And then let's style the card here. We have blog item. And then looking at examples, it has a border over it, just a simple border. So let's do that. Border, 1 pixel, a solid border, and then let's just use a just a really light gray. CCC is one I use a lot when I'm coding websites, and you can actually type it in here, CCC, and this is the shade. So, all right, we have here a border, and then I don't like the way that it's, flushed against the border here. We want to add a little bit of padding. So if you remember the box model, the padding goes inside the border and the margin goes outside the border. So remember that. So we want it to be inside the border. So we're going to add a padding of, let's see what 10 pixels look like. That's not quite that big. So let's do 30. That looks a lot better. Similar to what they have here. If you want, so this makes the padding everywhere 30 on the top, right, bottom, and left. But if I want to change it up to the top, I want 15 pixels, right? So this covers top and bottom. There's just 2 values, it covers top and bottom, and then left and right. Do that. All right, notice the padding got smaller, but if I include 4 values instead, right, it goes top, right, bottom, left. So that's how you can remember it. It's just the box model again. Okay. Now if we go look in here, notice how the paragraph tags have its own margins built in. Same with the header, paragraph, and the anchor tags don't have anything. I want to manipulate that because if we look here, these texts are pretty close together. So what you can do again is put a class on these. So class, this seems like it's a blog category. And then we can do here, name it blog item title. Here we do a class blog date. Let's remove item here since let's keep our names consistent. And then here class equals blog description. Okay, so we have these now. So for blog category, we are going to remove the padding on it. All right, so can do, sorry, the margins on it, not the padding. Margin to 0. And that removed the margins on it. And then the same thing for the other ones too. So for dot blog title, remove the margin, 0, save. That's good. I'm just gonna copy this. Date. All right, so those three are together. Same with the description. Zero. All right, so we don't have any margins on our text items. Now, why did I separate these out? Because if they're all just gonna have just a single margin, all in common, then what I could have done is chain these classes together and it will work just the same. All right, so if I remove this and save, you see it's still the same. But the reason why I separate it out is because I know that each of these will have more CSS styles to it. So I separated it out into its own. So with the first thing for the category, whirl. So that's going to be a blue color. So let's change that color to a blue. Let's open color hex again. Let's see, blue. This is too blue. So I'm going to choose, let's look at some palettes here. Popular palettes. Let's use sure, Google Colors. Let's copy this blue. And we'll go back to our code here and paste that in. And now our world is blue. And then looks like in the example, the font weight is a little more bold. So we can use either bold or we can give it a weight. 700 is typically a bold font. Do that. And you notice how it's slightly bolder. And then the example blog post here, there's just slightly a margin underneath. So let's add the margin to the title back. Let's give it maybe 10 pixels. What does that look like? All right, and we want the left and right to have 0. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's remove the text decoration, the line. Text decoration, none. All right. Notice now we have blog title and blog title. So that's not gonna work, right? So we're gonna have to change this to blog post title. I could have just kept it blog item title like before, but let's do that. Post. Okay, now we got our CSS for that back, and that looks like that. So now the date. The date was a little closer to the title, so we're gonna do actually margin For the bottom, we're gonna do maybe 5 pixels. What does that look like? That's pretty close. That's close enough, I think. So that's readable. And then we're gonna change the date color to something lighter. We're gonna try CCC again. And that's a little too light, so let's look for a gray. Mix that in. All right, that looks pretty good. So I forgot to mention here earlier, if you use 3 values, it goes top, left, right, bottom. Yeah, you can always Google the syntax here, because you know you can never remember everything. So now the description again. Let's add a little bit of margin underneath the date. So we can do 0, 0, and then 5 pixels. All right, so that's a little bit more separated. And then for continue reading link, what did I name that? Let's add a class here. Continue reading. All right, let's name that. Dot continue reading. Add a huge margin to it. Margin top. We just need the top, so we can use margin top. 50 px, 50 pixels. That sounds good. Okay, that didn't go through. Margin top. Continue reading. What's going on? All right, anchor tags might have a little trouble with margins. So what we're gonna do instead is add it to the description. We'll do a margin bottom instead. This is another strategy I want to show you guys here. You can do a margin all 0, and then if you add a margin bottom underneath, since code is read from top to bottom, when you declare this, it's gonna override just the bottom margin. If you did it the other way around, you know, this margin will override what was on top because code is read from top to bottom. So let's change that back. All right, that looks pretty close to our example here. So now we have that. We can copy and paste it for the other ones. Copy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so now we can see we have our grid item. That looks pretty cool. We're pretty close. I'm gonna close that and see. All right. And then check the responsiveness. Look how I mentioned that CSS Grid is already responsive built in, so I didn't have to worry about that. It looks pretty good as I resize this. The text looks pretty good too, so I don't have to worry about it quite much right now, but definitely recommend using either percentages or relative units if you want your text to scale properly. It's not as noticeable here, but if you're moving from a really itty bitty phone to like a big screen, it might be a lot more noticeable. Okay, so now we want to add a little gap here between the columns and the rows, so we can do that too. Up here, again in the blog main, we can add grid gap, and we can either add the row gap or the column gap or both. So we're gonna add it to both. We're gonna see what 10 pixels look like. That's a little small, so let's change that to 30. All right, so then now we have 30 pixels. It looks pretty close. And then the next thing that we have to do is the footer. So now for the footer section, we have a semantic tag for footers, so we can use that instead of section. Footer. What does it say? A blog template built for Bootstrap and C design system. So that's pretty easy. So we can just implement a text here. Blog template build by Bootstrap. And then another one that says C design system. If you look down here, we have our footer, just a basic footer. And I notice how Bootstrap and C design system are links. So what you can do actually is within here, you could add a link for it that links to the Bootstrap front page. Link. And then there you go. You have a link here. And then the same thing for C design system. Instead of paragraph tag, you can just go ahead and change that directly to an anchor tag. It's not a big deal. All right, let's style the footer a little bit. So we're going to give it a class footer. Blog footer. It had a gray background color, right? Background, oops, color, CCC. That's too dark now, so let's use Code Sandbox has a color picker, so that's really helpful. Let's use that. All right, that looks pretty good. And then our text was in the example is centered. So we're gonna do text align. You could use Flexbox here, or if it's not necessary, we can just do a simple text align center, and then that will align it center. And let's add a little bit of padding inside so that it's not flush by the top and bottom here. So padding 20 pixels. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I think the color is a little light here. So let's do that. What does that look like? All right. And then notice how we want to add a little space between the footer and the header with the main content because it's way too flush right now. So for the footer, I'm going to do a margin top, or you can do a margin bottom on blog main. So margin top, 15 pixels. All right, that looks pretty decent. And then it's not as noticeable up here, but we're just going to add a bottom margin anyway to the blog header. Margin bottom. Okay, so now we have this site. Now if we click on continue reading, it should bring us to this empty blog post page. So if I go back here and just add a, let's create the HTML here. HTML. We're gonna copy thing here, actually, make it easier. All right, so now if we click continue reading, it brings us to the blog post page. So you want to have a different one for the individual blog posts that you had. So just keep that in mind. So if you want to code these, you can have a separate HTML page for each of them so that you can link it out. And there we have our first example Again, if you have any questions, just feel free to Slack either Jonathan or I on the Slack channel. You can email us as well, whichever communication app that works for you. You can also, I'm available for one-on-one support. I will post the link to the Calendly if you want to have a one-on-one session with me. We can, share screens or just chat. It's really up to you if you have any questions or you just want to talk about career stuff. I am available. I will post all the links on a reference page along with the video. So I think that's it for today. Have a good night, everybody.